I really enjoyed the book, and Ninan's talked about what he would have on the front, but if I was writing the blurb on the back, I would probably say that it was punchy, thought-provoking, and even provocative. It's great to have a panel of journalists because, of course, we ferret out truths, but we also purvey myths as well, and report on people who variously construct these myths or try and break them down. Before reading the book, I've been very struck over the last few days about a few comments that Jim O'Neill, he works for Goldman Sachs, and he's the chairman of its asset management division, has said about India recently. He's called India the most mysterious brick. I think it's quite difficult to be more mysterious than Russia, but he seems to think that India is a mystery, and as a result, it's difficult for outsiders to engage with India in business. I was reading something in one of the papers yesterday that said India's a great place to visit, difficult place to do business. Maybe that's a myth as well, but I think that when Jim O'Neill calls India the most mysterious brick, he is getting at the issue that this book has addressed about the myths and how difficult it is to understand. Now, to begin with my critique, and I'll make it short, is that I really like the sequence of the book, I'm afraid. I think starting it with myths was brilliant. I think that if you started with challenges and reforms, my eyes would have glazed over pretty well immediately, because it's something that I hear every day about challenges and reforms, and there's endless talk about it. But actually going for a direct explosion of some of the things that are taken as given, but may not be given, was a very good approach. And of your myths, the ones that I like most, and I'll refer to what Jay Panda was saying earlier, I have to say I feel intellectually very engaged with this comparison with the US on lots of levels between in India and the States, whether it's about the Constitution, whether it's about the economy, whether it's about the history, whether it's about the formation of capital. And I do think this I mean, as Jay said, you've argued against it, but I do think that the comparison with this Gilded Age is quite instructive. It may be wrong, we'll find out, but it's instructive in that to understand whether India is in a transitional phase or a permanent phase, and also to understand how the American economy and these characters like Rockefeller and so on, how they turned from robber barons into something better, and how the economy turned from Wild West into something that was regulated and something that had a judiciary, and you had a system of governance that of course has its flaws, but on the whole produced an extraordinary economic transformation in North America. The second myth that I find myself thinking about a lot is this link between higher growth and greater corruption. I mean, to be honest, I haven't got an answer for it, but I would like to read more on whether the last 20 years has increased corruption or changed the nature of corruption. I mean, certainly the numbers have grown, and of course the big number of last year was this 39 billion figure produced by the Comptroller Auditor General that has kind of rocked the establishment ever since. But I'd like to know whether the magnitude has increased, whether it's become more widespread. Certainly in the Hazare movement, when I went down to those rallies, I mean, people weren't talking about gross corruption, they were talking about micro corruption, they were talking about ration cards and rail tickets and challans for traffic offences. And that exploded a myth in my mind, because I realized that most Indians are concerned about a different kind of corruption to the one that I've been writing about. And then third, which I think is you know, your big myth, is the question of the efficacy of growth and whether it changes the lives of poor people. I mean, that's the very kernel, I think, of your argument and the direction of this book. And I think that actually there's a job to be done for journalists in this, because what I'd like to see, and I'd like to do more of it myself, is actually go out to UP or Jharkhand or Bihar and go to a village or a region and find out whether people's lives have really changed. And you don't really see that in the press. You don't see it in the international press. You don't see it in the local press. And some kind of empirical analysis of what is happening to people's lives on the ground. Not the discussion in Delhi, not the policy discussion, but actually a real case study, and a series of case studies across India, seeing where, because growth is obviously experienced in different ways across the geography. And to talk of India as, that's in a sense a kind of myth itself, that the growth is a universal thing and is experienced in universal ways is plainly not true. Some parts of India are experiencing growth very profoundly, others are not. And then, if I may dare say, as a former editor, I would possibly in that first section whittle my myths down to 10 from 20. I think you've got a lot of myths there, and there's a lot of overlap. And I think if you really want a punchy, something that's going to really wake up the parliamentarians, it's going to be something 10 easily digestible myths. I think 20, the first 10 are taken in, the latter 10 not, probably. So I do a bit of editing there. In terms of track 1 reforms, I think it's worth, I think it's worth bringing it right up to the moment in your book, because plainly these are still evolving. I mean, in the last few days, there have been various administrative moves to bring in greater foreign investment into India. And this sense that India, again, perhaps this is a myth, but India only moves when there's a crisis, when there's a sense of crisis. The rupee moves, fiscal deficit looks problematic, people talk about balance of payments crises, then there are reforms. And I'd like to know, whether that's true. I mean, do you really have to have a sense of real fear before track 1 reforms take place, just as they did in 1991? So bringing up to the moment, I really liked your focus on labour laws and jobs, because often in the macroeconomic debate, we're talking about different things. And I think a new manufacturing policy has just been launched. And I'd love to have an analysis of whether that is going to translate into creating jobs. I don't get the sense, China is shedding jobs to places like Bangladesh and Vietnam, but I don't get a sense that India is getting any of those jobs. In fact, I don't get a sense that India is creating manufacturing jobs at all in the way that it should be to compete internationally. And then finally, infrastructure. I mean, this I think is one of the most fascinating spaces. It's plainly the one that needs the most attention. And there's a real disconnect. I mean, to talk about myths, there's a real disconnect between what the Planning Commission says and what happens on the ground. I mean, you just have to look at these figures that get printed, the $1 trillion needed into the infrastructure sector, and then look about exactly how much has happened. There's a lot of financial planning, but very, very little delivery. Track 2, I heard a speech by Jagdish, actually Nainan was the chairman then, about a year ago, 2 years ago possibly, which I like very much, which was where Jagdish was talking in front of Montek Singh Ahluwalia. It was a fascinating discussion, but it was about the need for second wave reform and I guess we could call it track 2 reform, and how the 91 reforms are now, I mean, they're pretty long in the tooth. I mean, they've had a pretty good run, but I mean, that 20 years is quite a long time ago, and how there's a need for a refresh. And ever since hearing that, I've kind of felt it in my writing, kind of saying, well, we actually need a bit of a refresh. We need a new kind of initiative. And I think there has been activity. Since he gave that speech, there has been activity in what you put in your slide there with Narega, healthcare, food security bill. Whether this is the right kind of activity is another discussion, and whether these are the track 2 reforms that might have been envisioned in the spirit of 91. I'm not sure that's the case. I think also that it's worth looking at the role of the private sector a bit more, particularly in the healthcare and education spheres, because plainly lack of public delivery is leading to an outstripping of public delivery by the private sector. I'm going to read statistics that 80% of Indian healthcare is now in private hands. And plainly, my own experience of people around me, they're all paying for healthcare, even poorer people that I know. In conclusion, I'd just say that the areas that I'd love to read about a bit more, and I again agree with Jay Panda, is I'd love to read more about the informal economy. There was a World Bank report out about a month ago which talked about where India is creating jobs, and it's creating masses of jobs in the informal economy. And I'd love to get a sense of what the size of that economy is. Of course, it's impossible to measure, but I'm sure India's GNP is probably much higher than we think it is, and possibly its growth is much higher than we think it is, because there's a whole lot of unrecorded data out there about what's happening, and particularly the labor laws have encouraged people to find ways of circumventing the law to employ people. And as I said, I think there's lots more people employed than we think there are. And then secondly, administrative reform. I mean, there is a big focus in Delhi on public delivery. And Martin Wolf, who works for my paper, I just had a conversation with him about the comparison between India and China and the modernization of the bureaucracy. I was talking about it yesterday with Professor Joshi, about how the Chinese effectively reinvented their Mandarin class and made them much more global and made them much more accountable. And I think, I wouldn't say there are lessons to be learned, but I think that in terms of modernizing the Indian bureaucracy, I think much more attention needs to be given to administrative reform. Finally, I've mentioned the private sector in the public space, but I'd like to move to the ability to enact reform. Something that struck me in my 3.5 years in Delhi is that there's a terrible failure to communicate economic policy to the people, which is really, really striking. I mean, there's obviously a great debate in Delhi, and Delhi is a wonderful place to work because the level of intellectual and output is extraordinary. But actually, it doesn't really go beyond Delhi, and I think there's a failure to communicate through newspapers, through the TV, economic policy to the people, which means that actually they're completely unprepared for reform of the type that we're talking about. And it's also a case that there's a complete failure to communicate economic policy to coalition partners. I mean, you're seeing that at the moment with the Trinamool Congress basically scuppering almost anything that the government tries to do. And retail reform, again, is a great case study where plainly I would think that's a good thing to do. But there are so many myths about what retail reform might do, that India might be swallowed by Walmart and the box store, that plainly you can't introduce reforms through a parliamentary system if they're not well understood by the parliamentarians or by the people. And I mean, I think that goes to, retail reform is on the margin, I suspect, but it goes to subsidies. I don't think they're well understood, and equally fiscal consolidation. In fact, the whole gamut of macroeconomics is not really explained to the majority of Indian people. Finally, I'd like to say that the sloganeering you find in India is also quite destructive. I think you've had the Shining India, you've had inclusive growth. I mean, again, I've been here 3.5 years. I'm not sure I'd be able to define either one of those slogans. Inclusive growth I found very difficult to understand. To wind up, there's one thing I'd really like to see again in the book is the link between growth and inflation, because that is also a kind of myth in the making. There was a breakfast this morning with Ratan Tata where he was basically saying India must not give up on high economic growth. And he was saying that Indians can live with high inflation, but you possibly can't live with lower growth. And there is a view in the policy establishment that India can only grow at 8%, 7%, because Indians can't tolerate high inflation. Well, that's a myth I'd love to explore. I mean, can Indians tolerate high inflation? To get higher growth, that seems to be one of the major issues of this time. Thanks, Lionel.
Thank you, James.